1859, the height of the British Empire. A German scholar named Max Muller is hired by the East India Company to undertake a massive project, translating the ancient Vedas into English. But Muller has a problem. He is working under a biblical worldview, one that strictly believes the earth was created on October 23, 4004 BC, a date calculated by Archbishop James Usher. To fit the vast, cyclical history of India into this narrow European box, Muller makes a decision that will haunt history for the next 150 years. He arbitrarily assigns the date of 1200 BCE to the Rig Veda. He did not do this based on archaeology, because archaeology didn't exist yet. He did it based on his own religious bias. In a letter to his wife, he explicitly wrote, "The translation of the Veda will hereafter tell to a great extent on the fate of India. It is the root of their religion, and to show them what the root is, I feel sure, is the only way of uprooting all that has sprung from it." With the stroke of a pen, thousands of years of Indian history were erased. The great cities described in the texts, the advanced metallurgy, the complex astronomy, all of it was dismissed as mythology or fantasy. For over a century, textbooks told us that civilization came to India from the outside, that the indigenous people were primitive, and that the Mahabharata was merely a book of fairy tales written by poets who had no concept of history. But in the 21st century, the silence was broken. Not by historians, but by scientists. From the multispectral satellite imagery of ISRO to the genetic laboratories of Harvard Medical School, the ground beneath us began to reveal a different story. We are no longer looking at myths. We are looking at memories. What follows are 7 scientific discoveries that prove the lost civilization of India was not only real, but was far more advanced than we ever dared to imagine. Chapter 1. The Invisible River. For thousands of years, the oral traditions of India spoke of a river mightier than the Ganges. The Rig Veda calls it the Saraswati, the best of rivers, the mother of waters. It is mentioned no less than 50 times in the hymns, far more than the industry. The Mahabharata describes it flowing from the glacial peaks of the Himalayas, cutting through the plains of Haryana and Rajasthan, and emptying into the western sea near the Rann of Kutch. But when the British surveyors arrived in the 19th century, they found nothing. Just dry desert sands. They laughed at the texts. They claimed the Saraswati was a celestial river, a metaphor for the Milky Way, because no such river existed on the map. They concluded that the Vedic writers were hallucinating. They were looking with their eyes, but they should have been looking with radar. In the late 1990s, satellite images from Landsat and ISRO began to reveal something startling. Hidden beneath the Thar Desert were the dry, fossilized traces of a massive river system, the Gagarhakra Paleo Channel. It was up to 8 kilometers wide in some places, a river channel capable of sustaining millions of people. This was not a small stream, it was a mega-river. Geologists and hydrologists moved in to verify the satellites. Organizations like ONGC drilled deep into the desert floor in places like Jaisalmer and discovered river pebbles, freshwater mollusks, and glacial sediments dating back to the Ice Age. They traced its course, not to the Ganges, but flowing independently to the ocean, exactly as the Mahabharata described. The implications of this are massive. Archaeological surveys now show that over 2,000 ancient settlements were located along this dried-up riverbed, compared to only a few hundred on the Indus. The civilization wasn't just the Indus Valley civilization, it was the Saraswati Sindhus civilization. The science tells us this river began to dry up around 1900 BCE due to tectonic shifts that diverted its glacial sources, the Sutlej and the Yamuna, away from the channel. This matches the archaeological record perfectly. When the river died, the cities died. The abandonment of Dwarka and the great Harappan sites wasn't a mystery, it was a climate refugee crisis recorded in real time by the ancient poets. The myth was actually a geological report.
We must ensure these texts conform to our understanding.
Indeed, the scientific claims are clearly fanciful.
Chapter 2, The Star Code. If you ask a standard historian when the Mahabharata war took place, they will give you a vague answer, or tell you it never happened at all. They argue that the text was written around 500 BCE, purely as fiction. But the author of the text, Vyasa, was not writing vague fiction. He was an astronomer recording a specific moment in time. Throughout the epic, Vyasa leaves breadcrumbs, celestial markers. He doesn't give us a calendar date because calendars change. Instead, he gives us the position of the stars, which are eternal. He writes that Saturn was at Rohini, Mars performed a retrograde loop before Jyeshtha, and a solar eclipse occurred on the Jyeshtha. For centuries, these verses were ignored as poetic embellishment. But recently, researchers like Dr. Narahari Achar used modern planetarium software to test these descriptions.
Those things became commercially available. And then I thought, maybe you could use this software to look at the dates of Indian texts, because we do have a lot of information, or sample information in text. And so we can project it and see on which day these events could have occurred. And so that would give an idea of the time of those texts.
This software, used by NASA, can simulate the night sky at any point in history with mathematical precision. They ran the simulation back thousands of years. They found that these specific planetary alignments are incredibly rare. They don't happen every year. They don't even happen every century. The unique combination of Saturn, Mars, and the eclipses described in the text occurred exactly during the year 3067 BCE. The probability of someone guessing these positions by accident is 1 in billions. This means the text wasn't written hundreds of years later by a creative storyteller. It was written by someone who looked up at the sky and recorded what they saw.
Mahabharata was not just a poem, but its time-stamped document, pushing the date of Indian civilization
Back by thousands of years, exactly where tradition said it belonged. Part 2, The Engineering of the Ancients. Chapter 3, the first dock. In Part 1, we saw the underwater walls of Dwarka. But a city of gold needs a way to generate wealth. It needs trade. And trade requires infrastructure. Just a few hundred miles down the coast from Dwarka lies the site of Lothal. Here, archaeologists found a massive, rectangular brick structure. For years, Western archaeologists dismissed it as a water tank, perhaps for drinking or irrigation. But then, marine engineers took a closer look, and they realized that the tank had a gate. They noticed a vertical wall, a spillway, and most importantly, locking mechanism. This wasn't a tank. It was the world's first tidal dock. Built around 2400 BCE, this structure was an engineering marvel that rivals modern port design. The ancients had studied the tides of the Gulf of Kumbat, which are among the most dangerous and fluctuating in the world. They designed a dock where ships could enter at high tide, then, they would close wooden gates to trap the water level, allowing ships to float and unload cargo even when the tide went out. They were processing goods from Africa, Mesopotamia, and Persia. Lothal wasn't just a village, it was the Singapore or Shanghai of the ancient world, an economic hub driven by hydroengineering that the West wouldn't master for another 2,000 years. Chapter 4, The Impossible Iron. Open any history textbook, and it will tell you the Iron Age in India began around 1200 BCE. This date is crucial for the mainstream narrative because the Mahabharata describes massive iron weapons, maces, swords, armor. If the Iron Age started in 1200 BCE, then the events of the Mahabharata must be fiction, because the technology simply didn't exist yet. But the Earth is once again contradicting the textbooks. Recent excavations in the central Ganges plain, at sites like Mulhar, Dadyapur, and Al Khatila, have thrown a wrench into the timeline. Archaeologists have pulled iron artifacts out of the ground, distinct, smelted iron tools, nails, and arrowheads, and sent them for radiocarbon dating. The results were shocking. 1800 BCE, 2000 BCE, even as far back as 2400 BCE. This changes everything. It means that while the rest of the world was still figuring out soft bronze, ancient Indian metallurgists were already building high-temperature blast furnaces capable of smelting iron. They had the technology to create the weapons described in the epics a full millennium before we allowed them to have it. The maces of Bhima and the arrows of Arjuna weren't magic. They were metallurgy. Chapter 5. The Tsunami Shield. We know that Dwarka was eventually swallowed by the sea. The text says the ocean broke its boundary and rushed into the streets. But did the people of this civilization just sit back and watch? No. They fought back with engineering.
At the site of Dholavira, the sister city to Dwarka, we see evidence of a civilization obsessed with water.
They didn't just build walls to keep enemies out, they built walls to keep the water out. The fortifications at Dholavira are staggering, up to 18 meters thick at the base. From a military standpoint, this is overkill. No battering ram in the ancient world could make a dent in that. So why build them? Computer simulations and geological studies suggest these were tsunami shields. The architects knew they lived in a high-risk tectonic zone. They knew the sea could rise. So they built a sophisticated system of 16 massive reservoirs and thick stone ramparts to absorb the shock of tidal waves. They were applying hydraulic pressure principles to city planning. This redefines our understanding of them. They weren't primitive tribes cowering in fear of nature. They were civil engineers actively working to mitigate climate disasters. Part 3, The Global Factory and the Origin. Chapter 6, The Diamond Drill. How do you measure the advancement of a civilization? Some say by its monuments, others say by its manufacturing. In royal tombs across Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, and even in the jewelry boxes of Egyptian queens, archaeologists have found specific red carnelian beads.
These beads are long, slender, and polished to a mirror finish. They were the most prized luxury items of the ancient world, but the most confusing part for modern archaeologists was the hole. The holes in these beads are drilled with such microscopic precision, sometimes 10 centimeters long, that for decades, modern craftsmen could not replicate them using traditional copper tools. The bead would always crack. It seemed impossible. So, how did the ancients do it? The answer lies in a material called ernestite. Archaeological digs in the Khumbat region found ancient drill bits made of this rare, superhard stone. It registers a 7 or 8 on the Mohs hardness scale. These ancient engineers had developed a drill capable of high RPM rotation, allowing them to pierce stone like butter. This wasn't a cottage industry. This was mass production. The sheer volume of these beads found across the world proves that India was the factory of the world long before China held that title. They were exporting high-tech luxury goods to every corner of the Bronze Age world, dominating the global economy through superior manufacturing technology. They were the Meliahens, the merchants of the East. Chapter 7, The Genetic Ghost. For 2 centuries, the most damaging theory in Indian history was the Aryan invasion theory. It stated that the sophisticated Sanskrit language, the Vedas, and the culture of high civilization were brought to India by light-skinned invaders from the Central Asian steppes around 1500 BCE. It suggested that the indigenous people were incapable of creating such greatness on their own. It was a theory built on linguistics and colonial bias. But in 2019, it faced the ultimate test, DNA. A team of scientists, led by Vasant Shinde and David Reich, managed to extract DNA from the ear bone of a woman buried 4,500 years ago at the site of Rakhigarhi. This was the moment of truth. If the invasion theory were true, she should have shown genetic markers from the steppes, specifically the R1A haplogroup. She didn't. Her DNA revealed no ancestry from the steppes. She was a mix of ancient Iranian hunter-gatherers and Southeast Asian hunter-gatherers, a unique, indigenous ancestry. This proved that the people who built the cities, who wrote the Vedas, and who engineered the docks were not invaders. They were locals. The civilization developed internally, organically, and brilliantly. The invasion was a myth created by colonial historians to explain away the genius of an indigenous people. Conclusion: when we step back and look at these 7 discoveries, a new picture emerges. The Mahabharata and the Vedas are not just stories of gods and demons. They are the fragmented memories of a lost golden age. A civilization that mapped the stars in 3000 BCE, that navigated the oceans, that smelted iron when others used stone, and that understood the geology of their own changing land. The ocean did not just hide the city of Dwarka, it hid the true origins of scientific thought. We are only now, with our satellites and our microscopes, catching up to the wisdom that was lost.
The history books are being rewritten, not by poets, but by the evidence itself. The lost city was never a myth. We just forgot how to read the map.